Hello, and welcome to this month's episode of Hadassah on Call, New Frontiers in Medicine. I'm your host, Mayan Hoffman. Today, people are living longer. According to the World Health Organization, by 2030, 1 in 6 people will be 60 years or over. In 2020, the number of people aged 60 and older outnumbered children younger than 5 years old. In general, though, seniors have been found to have experienced more conflicts than their younger counterparts, and therefore to know which solutions work and which don't. Various studies have also shown them to manage their emotions and their impulses better. Seniors can also have much more fun than those of us in middle age. With retirement, seniors are often given the gift of time. With an extra 40 hours a week not spent in the workplace, they can travel, take classes, and learn new skills, exercise, and enjoy time with family and friends even more. Aging is not a disease. However, some significant risk factors exist for developing chronic diseases in older age. Moreover, some conditions accelerate the aging process and can lead to declines in functionality and reduced quality of life. To discuss geriatric health, we have with us Professor Jeremy Jacobs, Director of the Geriatric Rehabilitation Center at Hadassah and Head of the Center for Palliative Care at Hadassah Mount Scopus. Welcome, Professor Jacobs.
Hi, pleased to be here.
Of course. Now, your specialty is quite unique. You have enormous amount of experience in geriatrics and medical fields in general. What drew you, though, towards this specific specialty?
That's a good question. I was always interested in general medicine, also interested in psychiatry, and drawn to sort of ethical stuff. And I found I sort of naturally ended up in the area of geriatric medicine, it's a sort of very holistic area. It's perhaps one of the last bastions of general medicine. There's no great need to do a subspecialty. And you end up taking a very wide take on the patient's medical situation, family, psychiatry, psychology, emotions, cognition, social aspects, ethicals. It's very nice. I also like the pace. It's slow. It's slow, and you have to go quite deep.
Does a doctor like yourself, a geriatric specialist, replace the primary care physician?
No. For a number of reasons. Probably the most obvious reason is there are not enough geriatricians around. So if you've got 10, 11, 12% of the population over 65, and you've got around 300 geriatricians in Israel, which is quite a lot compared to other countries, so we just don't have enough people on the ground.
Interesting.
But also from a conceptual point of view, we are seen slightly more as a consultant, sort of second line approach to things.
And that starts at around 65, that one would start seeing both a geriatric specialist as well as their primary care.
Well, most 65-year-olds, and I won't say how far I am off from 65, but it's not so far, will not consider themselves geriatric. So the WHO, World Health Organization, says 65 is geriatric, and it's terribly out of date. It's there, like, I think 15, 20 years out of date. We start considering patients as geriatrics purely based on chronology, on time, age, from around 80 now, 75, 80. You can look at it as a time function or as a biological function. So we'll also look after younger people who have got a massive number of chronic illnesses and functional decline, and they behave as if they're geriatric patients at age 65. But most of our sort of optimal patients is around 80 plus.
Now, Israel itself has a very large aging population. How many people do you treat on average a month in your department? And how important do you think prevention will be in order to make sure the caseload stays manageable as people live longer and need more care?
So right now we have about 11% of the population in Israel are over 65. The expectation is that it's going to rise. It's going to start hitting 20% in the next 20 years or so. And the reason it's lower is because of the large amount of babies being born in Israel. Otherwise it would be higher, as in the rest of the world. We see a small, a drop in the ocean, okay, in our department. About somewhere around 50% of all the rehab patients are over 65. We have under our care only 14 geriatric rehab beds and another 14 end-of-life care beds. But it's a very small number. And in terms of rehab, there's a terrible lack of beds. We're building a new center, and the geriatricians will be present in that center. But it's insufficient. And if your question is about what's more important, prevention is obviously far more important. And that's taking place on an outpatient basis, daycare basis, and no less important, although Hadassah isn't necessarily there right yet, is the home care and community care of older people. There's a massive growth of home care right now, and Israel's actually leading the way in the development of home hospital, home rehab, home hospice care, which isn't so new, but a lot of the other modalities are quite new.
And that's, of course, with all the new digital tools and digital medicine that's enabling that to be more effective, I'm assuming.
Yeah, undoubtedly. There's a lot of remote technology now. So you can do remote monitoring of blood pressure and heart rate and oxygen. There's people who, for example, in Jerusalem, there's over 150 people at home who are ventilated full-time with a tracheostomy, being cared for mainly through the HMOs. But it's a new area. It's a very interesting area. Hadassah in the medical department here, Professor Ben Yehuda just finished a pilot for very intensive internal medical care at home, acute admission at home.
That can make a huge difference in a country like ours where we have so few beds and too many people needing them.
For sure. It takes pressure off the beds. It probably reduces overall costs. Probably. Probably. There's a lot of evidence. There's a lot of interest in the area, not evidence. There's a growing body of evidence that says it's financially viable and the outcomes are viable in terms of quality of care and patient satisfaction is good. There's a lot of, there's an area that needs to be looked into how much pressure is put on the family once you get a chronic patient at home that's being cared for.
So let's talk about that actually, the family. First of all, does a senior citizen, I guess, or an older person start to prepare to age? And how do the children play a role in that in order to help them prepare to support them through the process?
Good question. I had a story from the
Sure,
Talmud.
please.
A story from the Talmud, okay, on the pod. So there's the old grandfather is at the end of the table, and the father gives him a wooden spoon because he drops it on the floor. And then one day the little kid is asked for a piece of wood and a knife, and the father said, "What do you need it for?" He said, "I want to stop making a wooden spoon, so I'll give it to you when you're on." Oh, so the point is that it's never too early to start from a social point of view. And it's sort of education, I think. And it's cultural, a lot of it. But in terms of, that's the social side. But in terms of the physical side of aging, it starts in vitro, there's a lot of lifestyle approach that looks at aging doesn't start at 65, put the switch on. It starts when you're 0. And there's a lot of models like that look at nutrition in young age, education at a young age, stimulation at a young age, nutrition at a young age, and see how that affects longevity. There's tons of evidence concerning that.
So there's ways that we can actually project or predict longevity?
Yeah. Yeah. I'd say there are. Yeah. There's a lot of studies. There's a lot of longitudinal studies. I'm involved I've been a PI in a very lovely study in Jerusalem, which has examined people who were born in 1920. I wasn't there, but Professor Stessman started it in 1990 when they were 70. I joined a few years later, and we've now been following them for 30 years, the same cohort of people.
And you said you had just completed some arm of research with about over 200 people over the age of 100, correct?
The last stage of the study, we saw them age 70, 78, 85, 90, 95, and we've just finished this last wave. And we managed to see over 200 people at home, all of them about 100, 101. It fell exactly during COVID, so it sort of messed up our study a little bit in terms of time. But we're now analyzing the data. There's some very interesting studies from all over the world. Blue zones. You have heard of blue zones? No, the blue zone is sort of like it's the prototype longitudinal aging longevity sort of stuff. They identified, it was founded by a very clever man who got a grant from the National Geographic And he went around the world and identified these blue zones, which have the highest concentration of centenarians. So he ended up in Okinawa in Japan. He ended up in Sicily somewhere. He ended up in a Greek island I wrote it down, Costa Rica. And he ended up with a little group of Seventh-day Adventists in California. And he found that that's where they have the highest concentration of 100-year-olds around the world.
Did he find
Yeah,
out
for
why?
sure. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so
That was the purpose of the study.
Want to share a little bit?
Yeah, so I mean, it's all very common sense stuff, but it's quite hard to put into practice. But it's common sense. It's not rocket science. It's good nutrition. It's to stop like the Japanese. So you have to stop when you're 80% full. The Rambam says the same thing also. You got to stop eating before you get hungry, before you get full. A lot of the people there will take their biggest meal early in the day, reduce food throughout the day, and then have at least 12 hours not eating from dinner to breakfast. There's other ideas at the moment in terms of intermittent fasting and dietary changes and longevity. There's a lot of interest in that right now. So there's diet, stress reduction. Nearly all these people had some sort of affiliation to a behavioral or faith-related practice. Buddhists, Christians, Jews weren't so prominent, but they had some sort of meditative or faith-based practice. They had a defined social role. They had physical activity, and they had a plant-based diet. And I've probably forgotten some other stuff, but it's very intuitive stuff. Yeah. Physical activity, good diet, sleep, stress reduction, and social structure and meaning. Those are the things that all the longitudinal studies continually show. Those are the predictors of longevity. And it's very simple, but how many of us are doing it?
Right.
The epidemic of loneliness,
Right.
COVID. There's a lot of work now, not a lot, but there's some serious studies that were published in leading journals about the damage that COVID had on older people, not through the COVID, through the social isolation,
right.
Functional decline, and social isolation leading to, general health deterioration.
So we make sure our listeners heard that list and they know the secret now. It's the long life. So we'll probably recap them again at the end and make sure that people can swallow those and maybe start to follow them. With that, in Israel here, we have very good socialized medicine. And there is opportunity to follow the best practices, but also to get the care that you need when you need it so that you can hopefully stay healthier and be proactive and preventative. Are there any specific areas that you see where Israel is struggling or doing an excellent job when it comes to preparing people for later in life?
I think a challenging area, I sort of touched on it before, is the growing number of older people who are homebound. It's a challenge globally. Aging population. Part of the central things of geriatrics is functional decline. Walking around, getting to the toilet on your own, dressing, bathing, stuff like that, getting out. And as you go up in age, we see more and more people becoming homebound, functionally dependent. What would you call they requiring nursing care? And I'll give you a number. So the average older person, so they say between 70 to 80 in Israel, sees their family physician about once a month, 12 times a year. Gradually goes up over age. And then suddenly beyond 80, 85, the number goes down to about 0.6 visits a year. And not because they're healthier, because at that age they've become homebound. So amongst homebound older people, there's an immense challenge. They're a transparent population. So I think that strengthening home care and it's also a way of reducing the number of older people that go into long-term care, which is a real challenge.
Someone struggling at home care, they go into long-term care?
Yeah. I mean, if you need 24-hour care and no one's really taking care of you nicely at home, then you're going to end up in a long-term facility, which is not often the best option. Other areas, promoting physical activity, preventing dementia, those are big ones, Physical activity should be easier, but it's hard. A lot of it is to do with planning, not at the individual level. Friendly town, age-friendly cities. There's research on the fact that if you make walkways with benches and trees and fountains, people start exercising.
Really? People of all ages?
Yeah.
Interesting.
In Jerusalem, there's the beautiful train track.
Right. I run on that every morning.
So so do I. Not every morning,
really?
but I run on it, yeah.
Ah,
And so you see there's a lot of people walking. So, before that, they weren't there. So age-friendly cities is very important. Dementia care. I mean, like I hinted at earlier, all this stuff starts early in life. There's a very interesting article from The Lancet, one of the leading medical journals in England. Not an article, a consensus opinion, which basically say that up to 40% of dementia can be prevented. Alzheimer is obviously one of the most common dementias, but there's others. It's about 50%, maybe a bit less. But there's a lot of dementias, different sorts. And the current thinking is up to 40% can be prevented by just good medical practice throughout the life, 30, 40, 50 years prior. Eyes, hearing loss, visual loss, treat depression, treat common cardiovascular risk factors, exercise, nutrition.
And that all contributes to dementia.
Yeah. It's backed up,
But what about all the medications? I mean, today we're also sort of in a medication society where we like to give pills to solve problems. And does that also contribute to either aging faster or potentially harming specifically memory loss or other issues?
Yeah. So part of a geriatrician's daily chore is to deprescribe.
Take people off medication.
Yeah. If you do Google
Mm-hmm.
deprescribing, there's a lot of things out there. There's sites and literature. And by nature of things, an older person goes to see one doctor, another doctor, and every time they see someone else, they get another medicine added.
And then they all mix.
Yeah. And somewhere over 6 to 8 medicines, we consider it to be polypharmacy, which means multiple medicines. And the general understanding is that polypharmacy is very dangerous to people, and we can try and get them off medicines. There's also research on the association of numerous drugs for sleeping tablets. We know they're bad for old people, but people take them. There's a very strong association with falls and fractures.
Taking sleeping tablets and falls. Oh.
Yeah, it's really strong. Most serious doctors will be very reluctant to initiate treatment with a sleeping tablet these days, certainly amongst an older person.
Because of the effects.
That said, if you come to our department, you'll see people are getting sleeping tablets. It's very hard to stand against them sometimes, Yeah. But nonetheless, the general understanding is that you should avoid those sorts of meds. Long-term cognitive problems from medication is also understood. Over-treatment of blood pressure. There's some nice studies amongst very old people, functionally declined. And if you start reducing their medicines, they improve longevity, quality of life. There's not much evidence proving the benefit of multiple drug regimens amongst very old people. There's a lot of evidence amongst young people. But if you take one drug amongst young people, it's not the same as 15 drugs amongst someone who's 90 years old who's got life expectancy of 2 years, 3 years.
So I want to jump a little bit to the mental health side of things. How much should we be focused on mental health with the aging population? And, is it important to have check-ins with our loved ones? What are the best ways to handle that to ensure stable mental health?
So mental health issues amongst older people is obviously a massive issue. Common problems, depression. There's a lot of problems of adjustment and loss, dealing with loss, which is often an inevitable part of aging, which can be a cause of anxiety with or without depression. I say the other major area of psychogeriatrics, most common one perhaps, is the problems of people with dementia who develop an enormously large range of behavioral and psychological disturbances. Checking in with old people is good anyway. It's a preventive means in mental health. One of the strong findings of longevity, of well-being, of successful aging is the fact that you've got 3, 4, 5 good social contacts. Also for young people, but most definitely in aging. All the studies come back to that. And according to the strength of these social contacts, usually family, but it doesn't have to be meaningful others. So that is supportive for your emotional, mental health, but it's also good for a lot for other stuff, maintaining functional status and general health issues. What can we do to maintain mental health? Communication, telephones, visits. They come out for coffee, go for a walk, do something they like. Phone up the grandma, Safta, Saba, Mama. That's just very basic stuff. But if we look at our society, it's not necessarily happening.
Do you see that changing in Israel a lot? Because, for a long time in Israel, people grew up among their extended families. And it wasn't just, in America, I think people move away a lot. They go to their nuclear family, becomes their network. But here in Israel, for generations, people grew up on the street with their grandparents and, the whole extended family. But do you think that that's changing in the modern day here? And is that going to have an impact on the aging population here?
My gut feeling is that it won't change because I think it's deep in the culture of Jewish culture and also Muslim culture. And in fact, it's interesting in Jerusalem, for example, there's only, I think, maybe 2 old age homes in East Jerusalem, as opposed to about 30 old age homes in West Jerusalem. So the older person in both the cultures is extremely respected, and there is obviously some downward change in which keeps up with the West, but I still see that the families are around the patient, looking after the patient. Israel has a very low rate of people in long-term care. You go to Sweden, it can be somewhere between 15%, 20% of older people will be in a long-term care facility. But if you look here in Israel, in terms of the OECD, all the European states, we're amongst the best for rates of long-term care. 4-5% of old people are in long-term care here.
And is that also the case in the U.S., or is the U.S. much higher as well?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Disruption of the nuclear family and distances and stuff like that. It fits in with the loneliness, all the talk about loneliness and the negative impact of loneliness. It all fits together with the sort of breakdown of family and the breakdown of social contacts.
Also, it's very hard, I would assume, to be a caregiver for an older person. Is it better or worse for a family member to try to support the individual in the house despite all the challenges, or to go ahead and put them in a facility if it becomes difficult? What's better for the older person? What's also better for the family and for, I guess, maybe the grandkids or the other kids who have to then live in that environment?
So it's a really hard question, and there's no one answer, first of all. And it's an individual decision for the family and the person and the patient. Most people would assume if there's financial capability and there's physical, the accommodation is okay, then to stay in your own home is better. Aging in place, that's like the buzzword,
Right.
We want old people to stay where they are and get old and if possible, leave this world from where they lived all their life, So there is that general assumption. But if it's a person who lives alone, who's got no income, can't afford a good care, then they're better off where they're going to meet people and be looked after. So it's not so clear. In terms of the caregiver, I mean, that's a whole issue. Who is the caregiver, So at the moment, the caregiver is often a wife, who's often an older woman, who's often looked after her parents, her children, and now her spouse. It won't be like that maybe 20, 30 years because of the change in society. But that caregiver, doesn't matter, woman or man, the caregiver is under a lot of stress. So you have to look, and being a caregiver puts you at risk medically, depression, health issues, chronic health issues, burnout. We looked at some interesting data on people who are ventilated, long-term ventilated patients.
In their homes.
At home. Okay. Compared to long-term ventilated patients in hospital. These would be people who went on to a ventilator for lung problems or neurological problems. Not talking about people in vegetative states. Patients could communicate. And most of them were old. And we asked a ton of questions. We asked the caregiver and the patients, and we were very surprised. We were very surprised to find that being at home obviously was better, but for the caregiver, it was much better to have the patient at home than in the long-term care facility. Much less stress.
Really?
Yes, there was a little bit more physical stress, but there was much less emotional stress, and the well-being of the caregiver was much better to have the difficult patient at home.
I think that's fascinating. I wouldn't have expected that to be the answer.
And we asked the patients a very nasty question. We put it in the middle of about a half an hour interview with them. And these are people on 24-hour or 18-hour, at least 18-hour day ventilation through a tracheostomy. We asked them, if you had to make the same decision today, knowing what you know, would you choose to be ventilated again? And 85% said yeah, which sort of blew us away a bit because we assumed that they'd all say no, which is interesting. And the well-being of these patients, how do you feel generally? They reported feeling not so bad, which brings us sort of to like quality of life issues amongst people with multiple morbidity and health challenges, and all this stuff about quality of life versus length of life. It's one of those eternal debates that we have.
So, with in many of our previous interviews that we've been doing, we've been talking a lot about genetics and the ability to use the newer tools to personalize medicine. Is there any iteration of that, new tools that you're using in your department that would be relevant to bring up?
We're not there yet. There is work. There's a famous Israeli researcher in Einstein who's done a lot of work on longevity genes, and there are longevity genes. But it hasn't filtered down into daily practice yet. It probably will. I'll ask the question you didn't ask yet. How much of longevity is genetic?
Yeah. That's a great question.
Good question.
Good.
Pleased you asked.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of studies. There's a few studies. And one of the more famous studies is from Danish centenarian twins.
Okay.
Twins.
Mhm.
Okay. And some of them are, some did, some didn't get to 100. And they looked at these twins and they looked them throughout their lifespan. This was like the last 20, 30 years, this study's been going on. And so if you get twins, they've got the same genetic, makeup,
Right.
but they obviously have different life exposure. So you can see what's the effect of genetics versus environment on longevity. And the general conclusion is, and this is from other studies as well, that somewhere around 20 to 30% of longevity is genetic. So if you look at
pretty high percentage.
Yeah, it's quite high. But on the other hand, 70% of your longevity is to do with your environment, and a lot of your environment is what you do with your environment.
Stress, diet, sleep.
Yeah, exactly. It fits in. So you got to choose your parents well if you want to live to be 100. But a lot of it is in your hands.
And is that, have you, in this longevity study that you're doing here in Jerusalem, where you watched people each decade, were you recording things like that? Like what their lifestyles were like, how they rated their stress levels? And then did you see a correlation? I know you're just finishing up now. You said on the 100-year-old.
We just published a nice article a while ago on optimism.
Okay.
If you're optimistic, does it affect the way you're going to age?
And?
So the first study that showed that stuff was from nuns, famous study in America, nuns who went to the nunnery at age 20, and they had to write an autobiography about themselves and all sorts of stuff. And people went back to this years later, and they took out all sorts of things, including the level of optimism. And it was seen that at age 20, your degree of optimism predicts extremely well longevity subsequently. So we looked at older people. Maybe by the time you're 80, maybe it doesn't make a difference. And we looked at age 85, we looked at age 90, optimism, and we divided up into happiness and planning for the future. I mean, you could do two different things. It's not really clear what optimism is, but how happy you are in the moment with what's going on and how much you're anticipating and still planning for future events. And both of them are extremely strong predictors of survival. Less optimistic old people, They didn't make it through. That's one example. What else? We just published something interesting last week in JAGS, the Journal of American Geriatric Society, and it's an article that we've been working on, and we were a bit reluctant to publish it. We looked at Holocaust survivors aged 85 and 90 in Jerusalem from our cohort. So they're living in Jerusalem. They've reached aged 85. We looked at them again when they were 90, and we did a general overall medical, depression, optimism, all this stuff. We couldn't find any difference between them and non-Holocaust exposed people, which is a negative finding.
Right, of course.
But it's an important finding because it fits into this sort of model of aging and resilience. Resilience is like a buzzword. In the past, there's been a lot of talk about frailty. Where everything sort of gradually falls apart, like an old car. Everything, we reach 150,000 K. It's time to think about your car because everything starts breaking. So that's a little bit like frailty.
Okay.
But resilience is the flip side, and maybe it's not exactly the same. So people who are resilient adapt to adversity. Not only they're not falling apart, but if you throw them some stress, they'll bounce the stress back at you and maybe get stronger.
So you actually found that Holocaust survivors were more likely in some ways to be able to survive?
The ones that made it to old age, they're the super survivors, yeah. They're like possibly even healthier than their contemporaries. There was an article from Tel HaShomer Hospital. They looked at rehab after hip fracture amongst older Holocaust survivors, and they did better than the matched people who weren't survivors. So there's this like, they're survivors. They have adversity. I won't say they thrive on it, but their whole existence has been dealing with incredibly hard issues and overcoming it. So it continues into old age, which is an interesting finding.
Is there anything else you want to add? I didn't ask you. Anything else you think people should know that we didn't talk about?
Ageism.
Okay.
It's not to do with Hadassah and then my little,
No, for sure, but it's an important topic.
It's out there, It's out there. I'm dealing with it organizationally. It's in the ministry. Ageism it's sort of a bit of a hidden issue. And there's a lot of health policies which often don't necessarily take the equality and the needs of older people fully into account. I think COVID did a lot to address that, put a spotlight on older people who were left at home and no one saw them for a year or two. So it's sort of in the public awareness, but there's a lot of health policies that need to be addressed. A lot of parim, a lot of health gaps, health inequalities that will have to be addressed because of the demography of aging in our society.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today. This was definitely fascinating. Just give us real quickly, just to end it up, that list of those 5-6 things that we should be doing in order to ensure the length of our life. I think our listeners want to hear.
The blue zones. It's not my stuff. It's the blue zones. It's out there on the internet.
Educate us. It's okay.
It's you got to keep moving. Physical activity. You got to have meaning. Some sort of meaning structure. You got to have some sort of belonging to a community. You got to eat slightly less than you think you want to eat. You got to be very close to a plant-based diet. They actually put having a little afternoon drink around 4 or 5 in the afternoon down there.
That's a good thing.
Well, they say it is. It's up for grabs still.
All right. That's the one I'm writing.
Put your loved ones first. Good social contacts. I think I said them all.
Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Okay. Bye.